If you look up ghost hunting evenings in Nottinghamshire, you'll more than likely at some point come across Strelley Hall, which claims to have more than a couple of ghosts for you to hunt. With a history spanning over 800 years and first starting life as a medieval castle, it's not hard to see why. But are the stories actually true? Get ready, because this is an interesting one. And so, of course, with a history that long, over 800 years, Strelley Hall obviously didn't start out as that Georgian stately home that we can see today, because the building that stood there before that house was a stone castle built by Walter de Strelley in the 1200s, after he was gifted the lands by William Perival, who was a loyal knight of William the Conqueror and actually the first sheriff of Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and the Royal Forests. And this castle that the Strelleys built, it was a proper looking castle. It had the fortified walls, a metre thick, there was a big curtain wall around the outbuildings, and they even had a dry moat around the castle. For all intents and purposes, looking like a bona fide castle. Although it appears that it was kind of just to keep up appearances, the moat wasn't a defensive feature. Because it was a dry moat, it was more just a status symbol like, oh yeah, my castle's got a moat. And then also, apparently there are no records to show that the Strelleys ever actually got permission to crenellate, which is basically the license to turn your manor house officially into a castle. So as far as I can tell, technically it wouldn't have been called a castle, just a fortified manor house. But to you and I, with a moat, big thick stone walls, the thing even had turrets, it was a castle. And it was absolutely massive, way bigger than the house that stands there today. And so 12 generations of Strelleys lived there, and they were all knighted by the king, they were fairly high up in society, but we don't really have that much written information on the place from that time. There have been bits and pieces come to light over the years, but not a great deal. What we do know is that potentially around the 1400s, the Strelleys added to their home and built a great hall out of timber. Like, we're moving on in the centuries, it's not like back in the 1200s where everyone wanted a big secure stronghold because someone might come and take your house from you if they fancied it. We're getting into more of the time where you can turn your castle into more of a palace. Show your wealth by how fancy your house is, not how strong your walls are, kind of thing. But it looks like sometime around the 1580s, there was a fire that burnt down this Great Hall. And where the hall was, the timber structure kind of fell into the dry moat. So by the time the Great Hall had all burnt down, all fallen into the moat was half full with burnt bits of wood and whatnot. And instead of digging it all back out, they just decided to fill in the rest of the moat at this point. And that was the end of the dry moat. It was completely lost to history until 2006, when there was some archaeological digs done on the place. And they found all the different layers of waste and charred wood. But it looks like around this time of the fire, and afterwards, the castle wasn't really being looked after. Maybe that's the reason there was a fire in the first place, I don't really know. But the late 1500s, going into the 1600s, it seemed like the Strelleys had other things going on, keeping them distracted from looking after their house. And there are a few versions of the story, but they all end in basically the Strelleys lose their family home. So the first version of this story, it's the one that's the most sensational, and it goes that Nicholas Strelley, the man of the house at the time, he had this massive gambling problem. Didn't matter what it was, cards or cockfighting, he was down to put money on it. And one night in 1678, he was playing cards with some other gentleman, and Nicholas was straight out of money. But he knew his big break was just around the corner. His luck was turning, he could feel it in his bones. So he went all out and put the deed to the estate on the table, and he lost it to a lawyer called Ralph Edge. You hate to see it. So that was, for the longest time, just accepted as what happened. But apparently, we don't actually think that that is what happened anymore. Nicholas Strelley was man of the household, and he did lose the estate in 1678, but apparently it was all to do with some legal troubles that the family were going through, and that basically they couldn't afford the lawyer who was representing them. So Nicholas had to sign over the estate to pay for all the legal fees. In interviews with the current owner of the house, Richard, he says that all of these legal troubles had come about because the Strelleys were devout Catholics. In a now Protestant country, England was very anti-Catholic at this time, but it doesn't really say what those legal troubles actually were, it's just that it was something to do with their religion. But I mean, it's more than plausible. It really wasn't uncommon back then for Catholic families to have to sell off assets to pay for lawyers, or even to pay fines given to them because of their religion. But another version I came across was that it wasn't anything to do with their religion, and it was because the Strelleys had been royalists during the English Civil War. And so after the parliamentarians had beaten back the royalists and temporarily overthrown the monarchy, supporters of the crown were often slapped with massive fines, and it could have been something to do with that. That's the reason why the Strelleys had to sell their estate, because they just couldn't afford it anymore. So many families were actually financially ruined by those fines that were imposed on them after the war, so So again, plausible. But whatever version of the story is the right one, the fact is that the Strelleys lost the estate that had been their family home for over 400 years. And in 1678, it became the home of the Edge family after the lawyer, Ralph Edge, either bought it or was given it. And so then the new generations of the Edges were born, lived and died here, but the castle was still in a state. And the Edge family, they were well off, but nowhere near the levels of wealth that they would need to completely redo the place. That is, until they found coal on the estate. They started mining and selling this coal, and they became very wealthy. As they made more money, they made more improvements to the home. And it's thought that around the 1780s, that's when they built the house that we can see today, seemingly around the parts of the castle that were still standing. Because looking at it, it looks like a Georgian house, but then there are certain rooms, like the very aptly named castle room, that's got the vibe that you've just stepped into a medieval castle with the metre-thick stone walls, and underneath that is a cellar, and then above that is another room. Like it's his very own castle tower. So the Edges, they would continue to live at Strelley Hall until the last Edge died in 1978. And there is a bit of a story around the last Edge too, and Emily Mary Edge. Bit of family drama for you. Because when her father, Thomas Lewis Keckridge Edge, wrote up his will before he died, he actually did something that was quite unheard of at the time. Because back in the early 1900s, it was still the done thing to leave all of your earthly possessions, your estate, everything to your eldest born son. But Thomas has had quite the falling out with his eldest son, because Thomas had actually disinherited him. He was going to get nothing when his dad died, because he'd gone and married a suffragette. Which to Thomas, that was a big no-no for your reputation. There was no way the Edge that was man of the household at Strelley Hall could be married to such a woman. Absolutely not. Leaving aside the fact that women had actually got the right to vote in 1918, and Thomas didn't die till 1931, so he was kind of just holding a grudge at this point. But that's what he did. He stuck to his guns right to the end, and so instead he put Strelley Hall in trust for his daughter, Emily Mary Edge. And so she's got it made now, hasn't she? Your family home in a trust for you. Brilliant. Although there were some conditions, and these really don't make sense to me. The first one is fine. She has to keep her family name Edge, so that there's always an Edge living at Strelley Hall. But the second one, she wasn't allowed to marry. And so by extension of that, with the attitudes of the time, she wouldn't be able to have children who she could pass the hall on to. Because it's not like, oh, if she got married, she'd have to change her name and then she wouldn't be an Edge. Because it had actually happened 3 times in previous years where a man was marrying into the Edge family, marrying an Edge daughter, and he would have to change his name to Edge as a condition of being able to own the house and marry the daughter. So I don't really know why Thomas would put this condition in for Emily. Because surely he would know that when Emily died, she'd have no kids, no one to pass it on to, and it was more than likely going to be sold to a different family, and then that would be the end of the Edges at Strelley Hall. Only thing I can think is that maybe if, because Thomas had had a bunch of kids, as one did in those days, the next oldest sibling was a boy, and if Emily Mary Edge didn't marry, then it would pass to her younger brother or his kids maybe. I don't know, that's like the only logic I can think to explain it. But either way, didn't shake out like that. Emily Mary Edge passed away in 1978, and none of the surviving Edge family members wanted to take it on, because the house had turned into a liability. Again, it had been left, and it was now basically falling down. Because another problem that had arisen because of Thomas's stroke of genius conditions that he'd put on his daughter was that the home wasn't a family home anymore. It was the home of a single woman. She didn't need all of that space, so parts of the hall would just go unused. And there weren't loads of family members to cater for, kids to look after, anything like that. So when Thomas died in 31, they had 60 servants, all serving the Edge family and keeping the household going. But by 78, when Emily died, they had 2, because she just didn't need all that staff. After Emily Mary Edge passed away, Strelley Hall was put on the market, because none of the Edge family were going to touch it with a barge pole, it was in such a state, and it was purchased by the Henschel family, and Richard Henschel, he still lives there today. But just to give you an idea of how rundown the house had become, if telling you that wind coming through the windows and rain coming in through the roof wasn't enough, there was an auction after Emily had died, selling off all the bits and pieces inside to try and raise a bit of money. The alcohol that was stored in the cellar fetched more money than the building. The building was falling down, it was going to take a massive investment to get it right again, and so it was clearly priced accordingly. But the Henschels have put in the work, they've brought the hall back to life, and now they rent out some of the rooms and outbuildings as offices, there's a little cafe in the stable block. Like, they've made a little business out of it. And another way that Strelley Hall makes a bit of income is by being hired out by paranormal investigation groups. Because, I mean, mean, the history on the land is old, right? Dating all the way back to the 1200s. That's a lot of history. But before I get into the paranormal stories, I need to give you the grain of salt that I have been carrying around with me so that you can view these stories with this same grain of salt. I mean, it's more like a chunk of salt at this point, but you'll see what I mean. Or you'll come to a completely different conclusion entirely, and in which case, please do tell me about it in the comments. But one of the interviews I saw with Richard Henshaw, he strikes me as very much a skeptic of the paranormal. Doesn't really believe at all, I would say. Very hesitant to offer up any of the ghost stories. But it was one specific thing he said. He was asked something along the lines of, oh, what's your view on the paranormal? Or like whether he'd had any experiences while he'd been living in the house. And in other interviews, he'd just completely shut down the conversation, like, nope, never had anything in the 40 years I've been living here. But this one interview, I'll leave the link in the description. It was with a channel called UK Paranormal Search. And Richard said, basically, with a building like Strelley Hall, with how old it is and that, you've got to have ghosts or stories of the paranormal in order to be able to market it. And I just thought that that was a really interesting turn of phrase. Whether he meant it in a way of saying, yeah, it's old, of course it's got to have ghosts, maybe. But then the part about marketing it, it kind of really threw up a major red flag for me. Because yeah, I guess any quote unquote haunted location that's hired out for profit is doing the same thing. They're making money off people, paranormal investigators, who want to try and capture evidence of ghosts. So of course, it's in their interest for these locations to have ghost stories attached to them, right? But just to come straight out and say it, coupled that with the other interviews I watched where he just completely shut down the ghost talk, not even giving it the time of day. I don't know, it just gave me the vibes of just in it for the money. The paranormal is another income stream. Make a bit of pocket money above the rent for the offices and the coffee shop takings. Is that just me being too cynical though? I don't really think it is. But like I say, loads of ghost hunt groups where you buy a ticket for a night of ghost hunting, they use Strelley Hall on the regular, which I guess is the same thing. The ghost stories are still in their financial interests too. But a lot of guests come away saying they've had experiences, whether they're actually genuine paranormal experiences or not, who's to say? But yeah, I just wanted to mention it because after I saw that interview, I was already going in with a lot of doubt in my mind. But these are the stories anyway. I'll present what I know and obviously how I feel about them. You come to your own conclusions, tell me about them in the comments. And so the first and kind of major ghost story attached to Strelley Hall is Nicholas Strelley himself, the guy who either lost or had to sell the estate. It's said that he sometimes manifests in the castle room, and he appears with this very angry, very frustrated energy, which the story goes on to explain as him being his anger at losing his home in the card game, and that if anyone brings a pack of cards into the castle room, there might be poltergeist activity and intense feelings of negativity. Kind of like, how dare you bring this into my house, that's the reason I lost it kind of thing. And it's also thought that somehow Nicholas put a curse on gambling within the hall. Although, as we now know, the gambling story is not thought to be the case. But it's also said that Nicholas Strelley hates women being in this castle room. And the legend goes that several, what was described as serving wenches, actually saw the ghost of Nicholas Strelley skulking about the estate at night. Apparently, this caused some of the women to lose their minds and either die from shock or kill themselves. And so now some of these serving girls also haunt the hall. I don't know, it just feels very sensational, doesn't it? Topping yourself because you saw a ghost. I really don't know. Could it be that he was still alive and he was seen peering into the windows of the hall? Maybe dressed in a black cloak, trying to scare the edges and their staff off the estate so he could swoop back in? That seems to be more believable. But I also don't think that anyone would have killed themselves over this. But anyway, the hall does apparently lay claim to one of the gold standards of a haunted house. Strelley Hall apparently has its own white lady, and she's usually seen wandering near the staircase in a long flowing white gown. And this staircase, it does seem to be a fairly active spot, if the stories are to be believed. There have also apparently been the figures of children also seen on these stairs, along with the sounds of disembodied children's voices laughing and playing. Some guests on these overnight ghost huntings, they also claim to get a really strong feeling while they're near the banister of the staircase, like an almost intrusive thought to grab the railings and jump off. And so now some people think that this may be the energy of the white lady, and maybe that's what's happened to her. She either jumped or was pushed over the banister to her death. Maybe, but as far as I can see, no records of suicides, murders, anything happening in the hall. Might be that we just haven't uncovered it yet though. Like in the 1780s, when that staircase was probably put in, that's over 240 years ago. But then maybe there was a staircase that was in that position while it was a castle. That gives you over 800 years for something to have happened like that. Or it might be because in never happened. We may never know. The panelled room, which is a huge room, got a massive fireplace in it, that's apparently got a resident spirit in the form of a tall gentleman who will manifest next to the fireplace. But that's all the information we've got on him. Don't know who it is, nothing. There has also been poltergeist activity reported in the old kitchens and in the hallways, but again, no detail of what this activity actually is, who reported it, anything. I'm gonna hazard a guess and say that items are moved or thrown, but what specifically, you know? Apparently mediums have picked up on the spirit of a stable boy who was trampled to death at some point in time, and allegedly this had something to do with the squire's son who had drowned in the fish pond before this, and so someone was getting revenge on this stable boy. Maybe he had something to do with the drowning, I don't really know. But the medium basically alluded to the trampling being a setup. Gaps, so many gaps. One story that I could definitely have more time in the day for is that apparently Emily Mary Edge, the last Edge family member to call Strelley Hall her home, has been reported to have come back after her death. Because obviously she loved the house, it was her family home, she would have had a lot of good memories here. But there are so many sticking points with this whole story tonight. There is no talk of how they know it's Emily, what she said to do, nothing. And so then that brings me on to the dungeon. The part of the hall that gets all of the paranormal investigators weak in the knees, but it's also the part that Richard Henshaw, the owner, doesn't really believe was ever an actual dedicated dungeon. Because of the way the room is, it may have just been a storage area, just a cellar. When the Henshaws bought the hall, the plans did call it a dungeon, so maybe someone was being a bit creative on the plans, or was it actually at some point used as a dungeon? Because there are stories of tormented souls down there. The stories go that in the early 20th century, the dungeon was used to imprison poachers that had been caught on the estate. Apparently, maybe during Nicholas Strelley's time, with his apparent hatred of women, a serving wench was imprisoned down here and left to suffer. And then there was a story about a coven of evil witches. During the 1600s, a group of women were rounded up and locked in this room because they'd been accused of being witches, and that they'd been practicing witchcraft and black magic on the grounds of the estate. The story goes on to say that these women put a curse upon the Strelley family before they died of starvation and hypothermia down in this dungeon. So I mean, depending on when this happened, if this happened, maybe this was the start of the downfall of the Strelleys, going on to lose the house and whatnot? Or was it a sensationalised story that fit with the timeline and added to the atmosphere of Strelley Hall? Because if, and it is an impossibly big if, all of this is true, we've now got two curses knocking about the place from the 1600s. Obviously the witch's curse and Nicholas Strelley's curse on gambling. But the main reports from this dungeon area are that because of quote unquote all of these people who were unjustly imprisoned, there is a terribly dark, bad energy down there. Like you can feel the desperation and negativity, and that people have felt something push past them in the passageway towards the dungeon, or seen dark shadows lunge out at them, which, in all fairness, does sound absolutely terrifying. Other people have even experienced things worse than that, with claims of being scratched coming out of this area, and it's all said to be the work of one particular malevolent entity who is apparently completely evil, and he's known as the Watchman. His full-bodied apparition has been seen walking along the passageway and apparently carrying a lantern that gives out a little bit of light. He's thought to have been a guard from the 1600s, so maybe around the time of the Strelleys, but guests today on their ghost hunts have claimed to hear the sounds of his footsteps as he goes to check on the prisoners. And so with a building that's got 800 years of history soaked into its walls, with generations of both the Strelley and Edge families being born, living their lives, and then most likely dying within the house, you'd think that Strelley Hall would be an excellent candidate for claiming the title of being a haunted house. But, and I can't believe I'm actually saying this, I'm really not convinced. But what do you think? Do all of these stories get your alarm bells ringing like they did for me? Or have you been to Strelley Hall on one of these organised ghost hunts and you've experienced something for yourself that leaves you 100% convinced, no doubt in your mind, that the ghosts are real and this place is haunted? Because like I said earlier, it's got the markings of a haunted house. It walks like one and it talks like one. Centuries of history, a bit of scandal in the 1600s. But maybe it's just the way the stories have been presented, it's just not been looked into. There just aren't enough details to both the history and the ghost stories for me to give them much credibility. It's just not enough for me to say that this house is haunted. Not ruling out that it is, but what I've uncovered alone so far isn't enough for me. I feel like I'm being very critical again this week, but the point I'm trying to get at is that I absolutely think that there is an opportunity for an actual historian to dig a little deeper here. Take a look at local historical archives, death certificates, anything like that, to see if we can find out more about the history of the people who lived there. Can we find out that there was a heartbroken lady who threw herself from the staircase on the night of her wedding after her new husband passed away, and that's who the White Lady is? Can we find out that there was multiple children who passed passed away young from an outbreak of smallpox in the 19th century. And those are the ghost children. Can we just find out for sure what the cellars below the building were actually used for? Were there ever any prisoners down there? Or is it just a dingy little underground room that's good for storing wine? I think Strelley Hall, particularly the paranormal side of the business, would benefit from that more complete picture. Like for example, the Jamaica Inn, their dedicated paranormal team are actively trying to track down the history of the place, so they can connect it with the evidence that paranormal teams are picking up. Or maybe, would it be that these historians pick up the opposite of what we all want to find, that disprove the legends around the hall, throwing into question all of the stories of the ghosts that allegedly haunt here? So bottom line is, right now I'm not sure this place is haunted, as I'm not going to be one of these YouTube channels that takes any old ghost story and sensationalizes it to make it as creepy as possible. There are plenty of top 5 channels out there that do exactly that. With all their information off Wikipedia. Sorry. God, I'm being a bit spicy today, a bit confrontational. But no, I do this so that I can give you all the history, all the facts, and all of the ghost stories as they've been reported. And then a little bit of my own rational thoughts so that you can come to your own conclusions about the story. But of course, I'll always put in that little caveat that my opinions are that, they are mine. And that I don't know for sure because I've not been there. But I don't want you to go anywhere because I'm not done. I'm saying all of this because it's not very often that I will choose a location like this where the stories are a little bit sketchy for me. Because mainly at the end of the day, like more often than not, I do still want to bring you a somewhat scary story. But the reason that I have covered Strelley Hall is because the lovely guys at Into the Paranormal have very kindly invited me along to their investigation of the place. And so I may have something further to add, a little bit more information. And so I think I'm getting back from that investigation around about now. Okay, so that was an interesting night. There were a couple of instances of things that happened which were a little odd. K2 meters doing weird things and such like. Couldn't really come to a proper explanation for them. Has it changed my mind about the place? I think that really remains to be seen. I think it's going to be really interesting to see if the guys pick up anything extra when they're reviewing the footage, but the doubt is still very strong with this one. Based purely on the stories that we've got to go on so far, it might be that we just don't know who is actually haunting the house. Like, there are centuries of history, hundreds of years, likely hundreds of people who have lived there over the years. Maybe it's not Nicholas Strelley there, maybe it's someone else. But even with that, I just think there's not enough to say with 100% certainty that Strelley Hall is definitely haunted. But obviously I'd love to know your thoughts, so when the investigation video goes live on the Into the Unknown channel, I'll link it in the description and comments so that you can go and check it out. But Luke, Josh, Mitchell and Connor, thank you so much for having me. And if you haven't heard of Into the Unknown yet, go over and check those guys out. They are brilliant investigators who try and question and debunk things as they're going, and they're just all around lovely people. So thank you so much again for inviting me out. And so if you enjoyed this story, let me know that staying up way past my bedtime to record this segment was worth it by leaving it a little like. And if you want to support me, I'd be forever grateful if you subscribed. It really, truly does mean so much to me. But anyway, that is all from me today. I'm gonna go take my makeup off and dive into bed. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I need to stop doing this. I can't handle it. I just want my bed. There's got to be an easier way of doing these post-investigation bits that leaves you, it's not even rush hour. Where are all these cars and bikes coming from? I live in an area where there are a lot of boy racers, and so I was going to say half of my time filming, but that is very dramatic. It's not half the time filming. I do have to stop a lot when there are boy racer big exhaust going past, just like that.